First, let me begin by thanking Ambassador Joe Warnell for hosting this event. Warnell is an old friend of mine, but I hope that this discussion will fulfill the mission of the Asia-Europe Foundation to bring Asia and Europe closer together. I also want to thank, of course, the heroes, Asad and Leonie, for the tremendous effort you put in organizing this event and for borrowing chairs from the neighborhood. And of course, Rod, Jürgen, Ellen, and Shafkat for their comments. So what I propose to do actually is I was trying to find a structure for my comments today. And I thought, what I try to do is address what I think are 5 big questions that my book tries to answer, and then comment on the commentators, because they have in many ways touched on these 5 points. So what are the 5 big questions that the book tries to answer? One is, has the Asian century arrived? Second, if it has, why now? Third question, will Asia tear itself apart? Which has been touched upon. 4, is the West part of the problem or part of the solution to the new global challenges? And finally, of course, what is the road ahead? And I'll try to cover these 5 points in 13.5 minutes. The first point, basically, the big lesson I learned from the publication of this book is that there is no global consensus on whether or not Asia has arrived, whether or not we will have the Asian century. And for me, the most telling indicator of this, of course, was the reviews. It was wonderful to get so many reviews for the book, but after a few months, the pattern became very clear. That in Asia, so far, I must confess, I may be wrong, I haven't found a single negative review. All the Asian reviews, and especially the ones in India, have been remarkably positive, saying finally a book has arrived that describes our goals and aspirations. And then in the West, to be fair, the reviews are mixed. I mean, as you quoted Jeff Garton, positive review, Foreign Affairs, positive review. But most of the other Western reviews, I would say, are more negative than positive. And I think that negative reaction reflects, I think, a resistance to accepting the idea that, hey, this is now the Asian century. But another more powerful indicator, of course, is the behavior of the policymakers. Because if the policymakers believe that the Asian century has arrived, then they have to reflect this in their behavior. But if you see as recently as 2007, right, which one of my favorite examples I use, you change the head of the IMF, you change the head of the World Bank, and you still adhere to the old rule that the head of the IMF must be a European, and the head of the World Bank must be an American, and 3.5 billion nations, with the fastest growing economies, with the world's largest pool of foreign reserves, now producing more economics PhDs than any other part of the world, don't qualify to run these 2 organizations. And that's a powerful indication of whether or not you believe that times have changed. If you believe that we still live in the era of Western domination, then you preserve your control of these institutions. If you believe that times have changed, then you change, and that signs of change haven't appeared yet. And of course, here, if you don't mind this, I apologize, once in a while I'm going to make these side remarks, which are large and sweeping and no time to explain. But if I want to see an example of a picture of the past, I just look at G8 meetings. This is a picture of what the world used to look like, and not what the world would look like. But look at the thousands of media who go down there to report these useless G8 meetings which achieve nothing. And that's an indication of the resistance to change, to accepting the way the world has moved on. The other big question, of course, is why is it happening now? And for me, frankly, as an Asian, the big question is, what is wrong with my ancestors? Why couldn't they have figured this out 100 years ago? I mean, the Japanese, to be fair, figured it out in the 1860s, how to modernize an economy. China figured it out, I say, by 1980s. 120 years later. Why? I mean, this is a great historical mystery, and since I'm ethnically Indian, I can also say that why is it that 300 million of my Indian ethnic ancestors allowed themselves to be ruled so peacefully by 100,000 Englishmen? How did they accept colonial rule so peacefully? These are the large questions that you need to be asked. But the good news is that it is finally changing. And here, basically, I think Alan is right and Shafqat is right. I do pay an enormous tribute to the West. I mean, I cannot understand how the economists can just say that my book is an anti-Western polemic. When I say that Asia is rising because Asia has absorbed and implemented 7 pillars of Western wisdom. Hey, without these 7 pillars of Western wisdom, Asia would not be rising. So we should all send a big thank you note to the West. How can a book that says that Asia is rising because of the West be seen as an anti-Western polemic? But the fact that this can be said is an illustration of the psychological resistance to accepting the change. And by the way, one of the biggest pieces of Western wisdom, which I think Asia has to learn, is, of course, I think one or two of the commentators mentioned this, is the way in which the European Union member states have achieved zero prospect of war. That is the greatest civilizational achievement, when you can live in societies when you don't have to fear that you're ever going to go to war with your neighbors. That's wonderful. That's heaven. Now, Asians haven't achieved that yet and have a long way to go to achieve zero prospect of war. And I admit it. And so this is another example in which the West is just so far ahead of Asia. And so this brings me to the third question. Will Asia tear itself apart? The reason why I want to emphasize this question is because I've noticed that a consistent pattern in the reviews of my book, and as recently, the most recent review that appeared in the International Herald Tribune, I think by Thomas Fuller 2 weeks ago, where he reviews 2 books, my book and Bill Emmett's book. And Bill Emmett's book is all about how the new Asian rivals are going to tear each other apart. And he says Kishore is wrong, of course. Bill Emmett is right, that the Asians are going to tear themselves apart. Now, it is conceivable, I don't deny it, that with new rising Asian powers, maybe China and India will go to war again, maybe China and Japan will go to war again. That's conceivable. But is it going to happen? Is it likely? I said no. And here, in one of the things that is remarkably, one of the biggest and most remarkable developments that hasn't been noticed in the world, especially in the West, is what I call the rising geopolitical competence in Asia and the rising geopolitical incompetence in the West. And on the geopolitical competence in Asia, I mean, just look at the obvious examples. In 1990s, if you had to predict whether the Balkans of Europe would go to war or the Balkans of Asia would go to war, you go back and read the articles. You can find them I quote them in my writings. They said the Balkans of Asia is where war will take place and the Balkans of Europe will be at peace. The exact opposite happened. And indeed, there were proxy wars in Balkans among EU member states. And nobody wants to talk about that. Okay? That is an illustration in some areas where Asia is ahead.